2 John 7, because many planoi, deceivers, have gone out into the world. And let me just stop immediately, point out that terminology immediately connects us back to 1 John and to the deceivers that are found there. And when we examine the specifics of what they were deceiving about, we discover that they were denying that Jesus Christ had come in the flesh. And exactly what we have here. When he talks about who these deceivers are, he then identifies them, and you'll notice planoi here is functioning appositively. Well, I should say the participle here is functioning appositively, identifying who these deceivers are have gone out of the world. The ones not confessing Jesus Christ having come in the flesh. And so it's very important to recognize that the New Testament writers were interacting with an early form of what is later to be fully identified as Gnosticism. It is one of the most important issues of New Testament exegesis and background to recognize how important this is, because in the first 150, 250 years of the church, Gnosticism in its many forms, it always took, there was never a systematic theology of the Gnostic movement. But it was really the greatest challenge outside of the church's own response to persecution that the primitive church faced, and from a number of different directions as well. It was a real challenge, and it is extremely relevant to us today and to doing meaningful apologetics across the board, because one of the primary means that is being used by enemies of the faith today to destroy faith in Christianity is to resurrect the Gnostics. Nag Hammadi, the Oxyrhynchus Papyri find, these have been extremely important to give us background and information, but the enemies of the faith have utilized this information to raise the Gnostics from the dead, basically, and to utilize them in the context of saying there were all these different perspectives and beliefs back then, and orthodoxy was just one of many, many voices that just happened to win out. The idea being that there was no apostolic deposit of faith in the early church. So it's important to recognize that the New Testament does specifically address this movement. And the ones not confessing, that particular term, acknowledging, confessing, that means that the Christians are described as the confessors, the professors, the acknowledgers of the incarnation, of Jesus Christ having come in the flesh. Now, what did Gnostics believe? Well, the docetic Gnostics specifically believed that Jesus was a spirit, but the idea of him having a fleshly body would be against their docetic understanding of the flesh is good, the flesh is evil, the spirit is good, and so they were the ones that would present a truly uninfleshed Jesus. He only appeared, Dakine, that's why they're called the docetics. Dakine only appeared to have a physical body, because otherwise he could not be one of the eons, he would not be one of the good guys, he'd be one of the bad guys. Salvation is getting out of the physical body, not having a physical body. And so Christians here would be identified as the ones confessing, the ones adhering to the doctrine of Jesus Christ having come in the flesh. This is the deceiver and the antichristos, the antichrist, singular in this particular context, but it's the idea that to stand against Christ is to stand against the reality of the physical incarnation. And before we can even ask the question, is there a proper modern application to a text like this, we have to understand what it meant in the original context itself. If you skip that part, then your modern application is automatically suspect. It's automatically questionable. And so the deceiver, these are the main deceivers that have gone out into the world. The deceiver is the one denying that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. And so the specific group that John is having to struggle against in the early church are the proto-Gnostics, who, while proclaiming themselves to be Christians, deny the reality of the physical incarnation of Jesus Christ. This is the meaning of this text. And so any further application has to explain, okay, if you're going to apply the deceiver phraseology or nomenclature here to someone else, then you have to, the burden is upon any serious exegete to demonstrate that the original author would have agreed with your application as well. And that's frequently extremely difficult to do. Extremely difficult. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. Unfortunately, people will make those extended applications all the time. But that's what you have to do. And so there's the context. The proto-Gnostic incarnation denying, physical reality of Jesus denying deceivers, the antichrists. This is the background. And so in light of that, we are to look to ourselves, watch yourselves, in order that you do not lose what we have accomplished, but that you may a full misthos, a full reward you might receive. And so he's saying to the early Christians, if you fall into this kind of a camp, you're fundamentally destroying the work that has been invested in the production of your churches, your local churches, and everything else, because this is a fundamental denial of a central aspect of the faith. So he goes on to say, so everyone pro-agon, going beyond limits, going too far, and not abiding in the teaching of Christ. Now, some might argue, well, you have the possibility, exegetically, of at least a minor contextual break between 8 and 9. You don't have to necessarily limit the application of what comes after to the main subject of both 1 John and 2 John. Well, you could argue that, but once again, the serious, fair-minded exegete is going to say, well, again, even if I see some kind of a minor break between 8 and 9, if I am going to read into, for example, here, te didache tu Christou, the teaching of Christ, something beyond what has already been enunciated in 1 John and in 2 John. So, central aspect of 1 John's teaching, love for the brethren, keeping the commandments of Christ, walking in the light as he is in the light, confessing our sins. If you want to take all of that, because these are the things that John has emphasized in 1 John, and add that in to the teaching of Christ beyond the teaching about Christ, specifically of the reality of his physical incarnation. I think that would be appropriate, but I would think that you would specifically, what would be inappropriate would be to assume that in John's usage here, and then you run off to something that Paul mentions to the Galatians, something like that. I'm going to take teaching of Christ here as the entirety of my understanding of Christian theology, would be to go way beyond what John is indicating here. And you would have to provide some, at that point, you'd almost have to argue some type of disjunction between 8 and 9, because now you've left what he was talking about, and now you've expanded way beyond that. And then you have the problem of it saying the one going beyond and not abiding in the teaching of Christ does not have God. The one abiding in the doctrine or the teaching, this one has the Father and the Son. Now, what's important there is that in 1 John, you had the argument that if you deny the Son, if you deny who the Son is, the essential nature of the Son, then you don't have the Father. So these deceivers that have gone out were not confessing the full deity of the Son. And as a result, while they were claiming to still be true worshipers of the Father, John is saying, in light of the revelation of God in Christ Jesus, you can't say that. You cannot go to that point. Now that the Son has entered into flesh, now that the Father has testified to the Son by raising him from the dead and by exalting him to his right hand, you can no longer in any way make the argument that a Unitarian worship of the Father alone is going to suffice. In light of the incarnation, you must honor the Son even as you honor the Father. If you go beyond the teaching of Christ, if you don't abide in that teaching of Christ, then you don't have God. You do not have the Father and the Son. But if you are in that doctrine, in that teaching, then you have both the Father and the Son. And we might just point out in passing that once again, you have one of those many texts in the New Testament where it doesn't make a lick of sense outside of a Trinitarian understanding of God. That is, it doesn't make any sense to speak of the Son in this way if the Son is just an angelic messenger or anything along these lines. So the one remaining in the doctrine, in the teaching, this one has both the Father and the Son. So if anyone comes to you, and humas is plural, so this would be coming to the church in probability, and so this would probably be a prophet, a traveling teacher in the early church, comes to the Christian congregation, and is not bearing this teaching. This teaching goes back to the teaching of Christ, abiding in that teaching, having the Father and the Son. If one comes to you and he's not bearing this teaching, the very teaching that's referenced up here, do not receive him into your house and do not give him greetings. And as we've pointed out before, there were no Christian churches in the sense of a building in that day. There were Christian congregations, but there were not Christian buildings as we would identify them today. And so there's a couple ways. When it says, do not receive him eis oikion, that could be into your house in the sense of the necessary extension of hospitality that in this culture especially was considered to be a given. When a traveling preacher would come, the people of the congregation would provide for that person's needs, food and shelter. And what John is saying is, don't do that. Do not give of the generosity of the Christian people to an individual who comes to you not bearing the fundamental doctrine of Christ that was referred to in the preceding verse, verse 9. It could also, in light of the fact that you had house churches at this time, the New Testament is filled with references to churches in his household, the church that meets in his household, etc., etc. It could likewise have as its application receiving that individual into the fellowship of the church in the house. That's a possibility as well. And you don't have to necessarily pit those two against each other because they'd sort of go together. And then it says, kairain auto me legate. So the giving of Christian greetings, for us, it's just simply, hey, greetings are not any big thing. We have Walmart greeters today, that's not what we're talking about here. There was, there is just as names carried more meaning, there was much more in the consideration of greetings. There would be a Christian greeting, the kiss of fellowship, the holy kiss, as Paul referred to it as. And it was something you only gave fellow Christians. So it was an acknowledgement of this individual's Christianity. And so what is being said is, do not give to him that specifically Christian greeting that acknowledges him, that anyone observing it would go, oh, there are two Christians. So when a Mormon missionary, if the Mormon missionaries knock on my door, people said, well, in light of this, I can't have him in my house. I don't think that's what this is about. I've had many a Mormon missionary in my house. And I can say, hey, Elder Smith, Elder Jones, or whatever else it might be, Elders Reed and Reese, the first two missionaries I ever talked to, good grief, 1982 now. 2022 is not far down the road, man. We're coming up on the big 4-0 since my first encounter with LDS missionaries. I posted a picture on Facebook a couple days ago that I ran across as I was cleaning some stuff out, and there I am. And No, I put it back in the other. I did remember I'm UBS third. Somebody on Twitter actually reminded me, hey, grab your UBS third. So there it is up there. See that Jesus said, I am the Alpha and Omega. That's actually UBS third instead of UBS fifth. I'm actually starting to think I don't have a UBS fifth, except on electronically. So anyway, but I was looking back there for the little red King James, because it's clearly visible. And I remember those gray corduroy pants. Remember corduroy? Does anyone remember corduroy? I remember corduroy. I liked corduroy. I thought corduroy looked great. It's going to come back, I promise you, right after I die. But you can see it in my left rear pocket. And the spine on that King James is sort of bent that direction from all those years ago. Anyways, I'm staying there talking to two missionaries. They're trying to lock up their bikes at the North Temple entrance. And I imagine it was Mike Beliveau that took the picture. And beyond us is the old parking lot that is now the big meeting house across the street. And that meeting house looks bigger than that parking lot did. Because it's a pretty imposing structure. But, parking lots are actually normally fairly large. You think they did? Yeah. So anyway, how did I get onto that? The idea being, someone will say, well, you can't even say hi to them. I don't think that's what this is talking about. I don't say to them, hello, brother and sister in the Lord. The Lord's blessings be upon you this day. May Christ's peace be yours. And no, I'm not saying that to them, because I'm seeking to witness to them and to bring them to the knowledge of the true Jesus. And so no one listening to what I'm saying is going to go, oh, he thinks you're all on the same page, and you're a Mormon and they're a Mormon, and so on and so forth. And just last time I was down in South Africa, Rudolph and I were sitting at Spur, where I eat a lot. I think Rudolph gets tired of Spur when I'm down there, poor guy. Though he seems to like the food too, and I do too. Their quesadillas are really good. There's just no two ways about it. But we're sitting at Spur, and these missionaries come in, and I see him sitting over there, and it's like, okay, we were done. We had just gotten done, and it's like, okay, Rudolph, I got to. And so when we got up, we started talking to him, and you know, there was no confusion on their part about where I was coming from. You know, very quickly. And no, I'm not a member of the LDS Church, but I've certainly spent a lot of time studying what you believe, and you know, recommended to them that they take a look at at the you know, debates we've done and stuff like that. That's one of the neat things. You know, one of the best long-term tracks I've ever found is get somebody interested in one of the debates you've got on YouTube, because they can't lose it. Somebody else can't tear it up. They're already interested. And especially missionaries, they may not look while they're on their mission, but it's amazing what they'll think about after they get off their mission. Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. So I'll come back to, so the point is, verse 10 is about Christian greetings to someone. And it's not about having someone come into your house, because when the missionaries come into my house, I'm not feeding them. I'm not giving them a location from which they can then evangelize my neighborhood. In fact, the entire time they're in my house, they're not going after anybody else. They're hearing the truth. We've had missionaries sent home after spending time with us, or as I can remember, the one time that, well, it wasn't the only time, but the time that I went to a missionary's apartment. And one of those two missionaries was sent home very briefly after that. Didn't finish his mission. The idea here is, do not give these false teachers a location in your area from which to preach something other than the truth of Christ. Okay? I was just sent I'm going to forget this as we continue on, so I just want to just send this. Someone asked someone else on Facebook, what's your objection to James White? Isn't he a Calvinist? And that individual's response was, so's the devil. So's the devil. The devil's a Calvinist. Oh, okay. Yeah, I just love my fellow Calvinist brethren that have acid as the blood in their veins. It's great. We'll be talking about them later. Anyway, so with that in mind, we come to verse 11. The one saying to him, Chiron, greetings. That's the Christian greetings. The one's giving to him Christian greetings. Koinai. Now, New American Services participates. You know what koinonia means: to have fellowship with, to have participation, meaning purposeful participation, fellowships with his evil deeds. So, what are his evil deeds? The false teachings, denial of the incarnation, etc., etc. If you know who these people are, and then you give them Christian greetings, you are participating in their denial of the central doctrines of the Christian faith. So, when we look at 2 John in its context, and consider the situation in the early church, this is a text that is meant to help avoid confusion. It is a text meant to protect, at the time, the house churches from the traveling miscreants who were denying the incarnation and not abiding in the teaching of Christ, so on and so forth. Now, with that in mind, again, if we're wanting to honor the text, then we have to be very, very careful when we make extended application of any particular text. I won't get to it today, but I need to make note of it. I have an article. I have an article in my Evernote setup from an Eastern Orthodox guy taking aim at, what year? I don't even remember what year the debate with Patrick Madrid was on saints and images, like 2003-ish, something like that. It's been nearly 15 years. Well, it would be 15 years. A decade and a half ago. Attempting once again to revive the latria dulia distinction. We're going to respond to that because, again, there just isn't a latria dulia distinction. If you understand the concept of semantic domain, if you have ever done studies of Septuagint translations of Semitic terms and how they handle these things, the idea that you can say, hey, as long as you're giving a statue dulia and not latria, you're good, would have meant nothing to Moses whatsoever. So we're going to be taking a look at that. But the point being, if you're going to make extended application, as this individual does in that article, then you have to be very, very careful about what kind of application you're going to be making. And once you leave the original application of the original text, you have to have a tremendous care to make sure that as you leave that and go someplace else, that you are not misrepresenting what the purpose of the original author would have been. There's a large amount of weight upon your shoulders if you are concerned about rightly handling the Word of God. If you simply want to use it as a bludgeon, if you just simply want to attack somebody, then none of what I'm saying is going to be relevant to you. It's going to be irrelevant to you. Now, the reason we're going back over this is prior to the last program, an ostensibly Reformed group said that I was in sin, even before it happened, but then during and afterwards, for having Michael Brown on the program, because from their perspective, 2 John 11 would apply to him. First, it's what that means is they are judging him to be a non-Christian. And so he is a false teacher, false prophet, non-Christian. And therefore, to greet him as a brother is to violate 2 John 11. Now, what that would require, of course, is that initial conversation that Michael and I had about the Trinity, the deity of Christ, Christology, justification, resurrection of Christ. They have lied on their website recently, trying to say that, well, as long as they're a Trinitarian, I'm fine with that. Anybody who's listened to this program knows that's just it's hard to understand how people can lie so boldly that way. But once your zealotry overtakes your love of truth, then you can do whatever you want to do. And this group is certainly doing that. But we talked about who God is, who Christ is, what Christ accomplished on the cross, death, burial, and resurrection, substitutionary atonement, justification, and went through all of that. But what you have to say is, okay, all right, on the subjects that John specifically enunciates, incarnation of Jesus Christ, came in the flesh. Yep, that's what Michael Brown believes. There's no question about that. The only way around that is to go, well, he's lying. And there's no reasoning with people like that. Once you have someone on, you ask them direct questions. They say, this is what I believe. And the only response is, lying. All false teachers do it, lying. Well, I can't reason with you. There's no reason for Michael to try to reason with you. I can't reason with you. You've made up your mind. Facts are not relevant to you. And I bid you adieu. Have a nice time. Go do whatever you do. You'll have to answer to God for your unwillingness to listen to what people say. There's nothing I can do about that. But for the people who aren't just, aren't willing to just simply completely flush any hope of rationality down the tubes, you have to go, okay, yeah, what John was talking about, loving the brethren, walking in the light, okay, but there's other stuff. And I'm going to read into the doctrine of Christ the other stuff. And it's all my particular theological specifics, the things that I want to emphasize most strongly. And so I'm going to read that into that. And therefore, they go beyond that. They go beyond what I define as the doctrine of Christ.